My name is Marcus Kolga. I'm a senior fellow at MLI, and I have the honor of being the moderator of today's chat. As many of those in attendance here would know, MLI is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. In the past decade, it has become the leading independent federal public policy think tank in Ottawa and one of the go-to sources for fresh thinking on national issues in this country. With events like this, we have the opportunity to bring some terrific expertise to bear on the many issues and challenges Canadian policymakers have to deal with at home and abroad. On behalf of MLI, I'd like to thank the United States Embassy in Canada for its support of this event, our staff here at MLI, our panelists, and of course all of you who've submitted questions and have tuned in today. Over the next hour, our panelists will help us make sense of the barrage of malign foreign disinformation that has polluted our information environment over the past years, culminating in what today many are calling an infodemic. Over the past years, we've witnessed state-sponsored interference in multiple elections, attempts to polarize our societies, and efforts to manipulate our domestic and foreign policies in order to tilt them in favor of those malign states. The information warfare and influence campaigns undertaken by regimes in China, Russia, Iran, and beyond do not just target elections, they target our democracies and our societies. In the context of the COVID pandemic, the European External Action Service and Commission Vice President Vera Jourova warned just yesterday that both Russia and China are engaging in dangerous disinformation campaigns that are putting lives at risk. A recent survey found that half of all Canadians are unable to identify coronavirus disinformation, and that they believe at least one conspiracy or myth about it, ranging from origin conspiracies to cures. The George Floyd demonstrations in the United States have also been targeted with disinformation by pro-Kremlin platforms. According to the EU's Eastern Stratcom, Russian state media made the ridiculous claim last week that 80% of crime in the US is caused by Black Americans, while other platforms claim that George Soros and Bill Gates are financing Black gangs. In Canada, what is clear is that we are not adequately addressing this problem despite repeated warnings by our own and allied intelligence agencies. A recently released report by Canada's all-party National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians warned that if our government continues to leave the threat of malign foreign disinformation unaddressed, it will slowly erode the foundations of our fundamental institutions, including our system of democracy itself. Lucky for us, we're joined by three outstanding experts on information warfare and influence operations who will help us understand these threats and what they might look like in the post-COVID era. First, in addition to being the most quoted China expert in Canada at the moment, Charles Burton is Associate Professor at Brock University, specializing in comparative politics, government and politics of China, Canada-China relations, and human rights. He served as counselor at the Canadian Embassy to China between 1991 to 1993, and then again between 1998 and 2000. Before teaching at Brock, Charles worked at the Communications Security Establishment of the Canadian Department of National Defence. He's also a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Suzanne Spalding is Senior Advisor for Homeland Security and Director of the Defending Democratic Institutions Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She also serves as a member of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Prior to joining CSIS, Ms. Spalding was Undersecretary at the Department of Homeland Security, leading the National Protection and Programs Directorate, which has since been renamed the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Michael Weiss is an editor-at-large at the Daily Beast and is the Director of Special Investigations at the Free Russia Foundation. His first book, ISIS, Inside the Army of Terror, was a New York Times bestseller. In 2014, Michael co-authored a landmark report on Russian disinformation with Peter Pomerantsev titled The Menace of Unreality, How the Kremlin Weaponizes Information, Culture, and Money, which is regarded by many senior Russian disinformation analysts and myself as one of the most important research papers on Russian disinformation in the past decade. Our guests will give introductory remarks, which will be followed by discussion and audience questions. Now, without further ado, it is a great honor for me to call on Michael Weiss to guide us through the menace of the Kremlin's unreality in the COVID era and beyond. Michael, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marcus, and thanks for all attending. So broadly, I would say this about Russian state media's attempt to spread falsehoods and disinformation about the COVID-19 pandemic. You can start with what I'd call the low-hanging fruit, which is to say conspiracy theories and, sort of various claims of lunacy and craziness, particularly the allegation that Bill Gates is somehow responsible for the coronavirus as a way to microchip human beings and control population growth. Channel 1, Russia's most popular television station, ran a long segment about this. But what was interesting about this segment, and this is actually a rather common trope in Kremlin-backed disinformation schemes, is that the sources, or the so-called sources they relied on, were all Western ones. There was, in fact, a Canadian pro-life organization that was used. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's a prominent anti-vaccination activist and also famously the son of RFK in the United States, was cited. And another, I think, a homeopathic medicine website registered in Florida. So what they're doing essentially is taking some of the homegrown conspiracy theories in the West and simply amplifying them and lending their imprimatur of state media license to them. But I have to say, what I've noticed the most coming out of Russia is a more top-line strategy, which I've called Europe is the sick man and we are the cure. So what this strategy focuses on really has been the European Union and NATO countries' failure to contain and control the coronavirus, not only within their own borders, but externally to neighboring countries, particularly those looking to either to join one of those two supranational organizations. So you've seen, for instance, various cases, most notoriously perhaps Dmitry Kislyak, who is the kind of propagandist in chief for the Russian government, sanctioned by the EU and the United States for his role in promoting the invasion of Ukraine, suggests that the Schengen system of visa-free travel in Europe had completely collapsed at the start of the pandemic, suggesting falsely that France and Germany had restricted their exports as a result of the pandemic and not, as was the case, due to their own internal deficit crises. Trafficking in easily debunked falsehoods, but the overarching theme of which is that Europe as a project, as an integrated project, is failing, and that the only bulwark to essentially contain this global contagion is Russia. And I can point to several other examples, but the most interesting is actually not something that has been purely conveyed by Russian state media organs, but was really one of the most clever and frankly successful influence operations of this whole crisis. So what I'd like to focus on for the remainder of my talk is From Russia with Love, the Russian so-called humanitarian mission to Italy, which was exceptionally well executed, but for two major problems that the Kremlin faced. But to begin with, look at the logistics of this, right? In 2 days in late March, 15 Russian planes arrive at Pratica del Mare military air base, which lies just southwest of Rome, offloading dozens of vehicles, all kinds of equipment, and most notably 122 officers of the Radiological, Chemical, and Biological Weapons Defense Unit. The airport, interesting to note, is 372 miles south of what was really the epicenter in Italy for the pandemic crisis, which was Bergamo. And what's interesting about that is Bergamo has got its own airport, the Orio al Serio airport, where these planes could have easily flown into and offloaded their cargo, instead of taking a road convoy, the length of which is approximately 6.5 or 7 hours by car. So why did Russia fly out of its way to do this kind of land cruise through a NATO member state? In raising the question, I think I probably answered it. The mission, as I mentioned, was called From Russia with Love. That was the banner translated into Russian, English, and Italian, which adorned all of these military vehicles and buses. So essentially, it was the kind of traveling road show to demonstrate the Kremlin's greater effectiveness in containing the virus, and B, their sort of charitable humanitarian resolve to help a struggling European country, which was the most hard hit by the virus. But this mission included very many photo opportunities, one of the most famous of which now was the mission head, General Sergey Kitkov, who had prior to this been known in Western circles for his outspoken allegations, conspiracy theories really, about Syrian chemical weapons use. He had blamed the Western finance White House, the rescue workers in Syria, for staging the Duma chemical weapons attack in 2018, which is now the subject of an OPCW investigation. But here is a photo of General Kitkov standing next to his Italian counterpart, surveying a map of Italy. This was transmitted all over the Russian state media, and the symbolism could not have been starker, right? Russian military has landed in NATO territory. And not only that, they've done this with the invitation of the NATO government because NATO itself cannot control this virus, this plague. Other photo opportunities included, and this without any seeming Kremlin intervention, Italians legitimately thanking and showing their gratitude to Vladimir Putin personally and to Russia itself, in some cases tearing down the EU flag and raising the Russian tricolor. And all of this would have worked brilliantly for the Kremlin, but for, as I mentioned earlier, two big problems. The first was a La Stampa investigative piece by the journalist Jacopo Jacobani, who, and this is now, I'm sure everyone has read it because it's become notorious in Russia, alleged that 80% of the Russian equipment brought to Italy was useless, and also that Italy's PM was basically forced, or rather indulged, Russia's geopolitical power play, an active measure, an influence operation out of sheer desperation. And this whole thing was being regarded quite with a great deal of embarrassment, not only in other capitals, but in Rome itself. Well, the Russian government reaction to that investigative piece was nothing short of hysterical. The defense ministry spokesman issued a very verbose and conspiratorial reply that was chock-a-block with all the buzzwords that this was a Cold War mentality, this was just nothing short of Russophobia, et cetera, and ended with a Latin injunction that he who digs his own grave will fall into it, or he who digs his own ditch will fall into it, which seemed to kind of menace the investigative reporter and the outlet itself. And that was followed by the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, Maria Zakharovna, suggesting rather strangely that this whole thing was a British commercial conspiracy, relying on a dodgy Russian website which alleged that La Stampa was owned by the Chrysler Corporation, which is untrue. So anyway, this backfired catastrophically because Italian civil society and Italian officialdom, which days earlier had welcomed Russia in, started to show solidarity with their own reporters and declared or affirmed the right of a free press in Italy. Later, the reporting by La Stampa was confirmed and corroborated by other sources. More Italian officials and former and current NATO officials came out and said, this whole thing is very suspect. They said, first of all, Italy has got its own biological and chemical defense weapons unit, which is actually second to none in the NATO alliance. And Italy did not think it necessary to deploy them to the streets of Bergamo to spray disinfectant all over. So why was Russia welcomed in to do this? Hamish de Breton-Gordon, who's the former commander of NATO's Rapid Reaction CBRN Battalion, told the website Coda Story, which worked in conjunction with La Stampa, that it was doubtless to him that the radiological, chemical, biological, and defense forces that Russia had sent in were also working in collaboration with GRU military intelligence. So in other words, Russia was using this as also an opportunity not just to send a message to the world that they were doing what Europe could not, but also as an opportunity to conduct espionage on NATO territory. And a friend of mine who's an excellent reporter in Moscow, Andrei Soldatov, pointed out that in past instances of natural disasters where Russia has wanted to wage one of these humanitarian missions, the ministry that was responsible was the Emergency Situations Ministry. So, for example, after 9/11, it was the Emergency Situations Ministry that offered to send plane loads of blankets or whatever to New York City. They were rebuffed by the U.S. government. They did manage to send relief equipment after Hurricane Sandy in New York City in 2012. The head of that ministry was one Sergey Shoigu, who up until about 2013, I believe, then became the head of the Russian Defense Ministry. So now this really does seem like Shoigu's sort of toolkit, if you like. And of course, as the Russian defense minister, he is overseeing the military forces and personnel that were deployed to Italy. But I have yet to speak to any Western official about this operation. And by the way, I mean, of course, the heavy-handed naming of it, the 007 nature from Russia with love, doesn't really leave much mystery as to what else Russian troops were getting up to on NATO's soil. It was a trolling operation against Brussels, against Rome to some extent. But yeah, I mean, it was also seen by many Western officials as a rather dangerous opportunity to let Russian spies into sovereign European territory and possibly conduct human intelligence operations, signals intelligence operation, but God knows what else. So in that respect, you know, I think some of the goodwill that was engendered in those first 2 days and the end of March has somewhat dissipated. And now the kind of sober reality has dawned on Europe and on NATO that this was a grave mistake and also an unnecessary measure in terms of a public health and safety crisis.
Well, thanks for that. And I think it's worth noting as well that in mid-April, Italy's La Repubblica newspaper reported that Italians were being offered 200 euros each to say something positive about Russian aid. So clearly there was an information aspect to all of that. Thanks for that, Michael. Ms. Spalding, you've been monitoring foreign disinformation interference very closely for a long time. How are things looking from the U.S. perspective right now?
Yeah, Marcus, thank you. And Michael, thank you for that terrific summary, really fascinating. And for, reminding us that when we look at disinformation related to coronavirus, we need to put it in this broader ongoing context, right? That it is all of a piece. And so I really first started looking in depth at Russian disinformation and information operations when I was the undersecretary at DHS, responsible for cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection. And so in 2016, I spent a lot of time worrying about our election infrastructure, but not just from a cybersecurity standpoint, but really primarily from an information operations perspective. Even the traditional cybersecurity concerns around hacking into the DNC and people like John Podesta's email, we saw was really to enable then that subsequent release of that information and, if you will, weaponization of that information. Even the cybersecurity attacks targeting our voter registration databases, we quickly realized was likely not about the confidentiality of that data, which isn't particularly sensitive, but about the integrity of that data and access to that data that could be disrupted in a way that would disrupt voting on election day. And all of that was designed, we believe, to reduce Americans' trust in the legitimacy of the election process and therefore potentially in the legitimacy of the outcome. And most of that activity was at a time earlier in the year when it looked like Hillary Clinton was likely to win. So definitely mindful that a key objective of these information operations designed to reduce voter turnout and engagement. So when I got out in 2017 with the change of administrations, started thinking about what we knew, which was that the information operations were part of an ongoing long-term activity by Russia, did not begin by any means in 2016, and that it was part of a long-term ongoing effort to undermine democracy and trust in democratic institutions. And so I thought to myself, all right, I come out of the intelligence community, I'm going to do some red teaming. If I were Putin and I wanted to undermine democratic institutions, where would I go next? What other institution, like elections, is as dependent upon public faith and confidence in the legitimacy of the process to allow the public to accept the legitimacy of the outcome? And I am a trained lawyer. I'm a lawyer by training. And so I thought immediately of the justice system. And as we started looking into it, and I affiliated with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and we started looking into, trying to prepare for something we had not yet seen, we began to realize that no, they've been up to this for quite some time. And in fact, we have accumulated a significant body of evidence of information operations targeting the American public's faith and confidence in the independence and impartiality of our justice system. We understand that what Putin does is exploit weaknesses of our own making, vulnerabilities and ammunition that we hand over. So the weaknesses in our institutions, including our justice system, are ripe for amplification and exploitation by Russia, which is exactly what's happened. The difference between the Russian disinformation that we see pushing these narratives around our justice system being corrupt in the hands of corrupt politicians, corrupt corporations, being racist, being favoring immigrants, they are all building on legitimate grievances and concerns. right? But the difference between what they are pushing in their narratives and what the protesters in the streets of America today and my friends who are judicial reform advocates are doing is that those people are advocating for change. They are trying to hold institutions accountable to make us stronger as a nation. That is not Putin's goal. So what we see instead in the narratives that are coming out, whether it's around coronavirus, whether it's around the justice system generally, whether it's around what's happening in our streets today, is a narrative that says not only is the West incompetent, it is corrupt and hypocritical, and it is irrevocably so. Right? The idea is to rob the public of any hope for change, for bringing about change, to inflict, to provoke despair and disengagement, because an informed and engaged citizenry is essential for a healthy democracy. So we have been pushing back in all of the ways that lots of people talk about. We're training the institutions of justice to be more accountable. We are trying to educate the public, but really important is building public resilience. And a big part of against this pernicious messaging, right? And so a big part of that is a renewal of civic education. Not just reminding Americans of our shared values, that's really important, but also educating Americans about the ways in which they as individuals can make a difference. And I will close by just noting, I think Michael's story points out some of the ways in which, while we, in our discussion about Russian disinformation, are sometimes criticized for lionizing Putin as being this great genius, Michael's story, I think, shows that they may think they're clever, but that it often backfires. I would also say that I have seen some indications that he doesn't really appreciate the strength of a democracy. The Russian military doctrine that is so often cited talks about tapping into the protest potential of the population. Putin sees that as an existential threat because it is to authoritarian regimes. What he doesn't fully appreciate is that protest can be a very good sign of a healthy democracy if it brings about change. And that's really what we're working on now in America, is to sustain public engagement, avoid despair by making sure that our institutions are accountable and that individual members of the public understand their role in holding those institutions accountable. I will come back to this in the Q&A on the implications, I think, for our elections coming up as we bring COVID, disinformation, and a close election together.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that, Suzanne. And I'm glad that you've brought up the point that these disinformation campaigns and information warfare, it's not just targeting elections. In Canada, we've focused far too much on just the elections and not the problem with the broader democracy in society. This is a whole of democracy, whole of society problem, not just elections. Thanks again, Suzanne. Charles Burton, can you help us make sense of China's disinformation and influence campaigns here in Canada and beyond, where Chinese diplomats have been flinging accusations of conspiracy theories at Canada, the US and our allies, and politicians who, and in Canada here, politicians who are even afraid to say Taiwan's name at this point. What's going on? Why are they doing this?
Well, I think that you have to look at the background. I mean, when the novel coronavirus became known to the Chinese regime, there was a period of bureaucratic panic while the Chinese Communist Party tried to figure out the way to respond to it. That then incurred a delay in reporting to the WHO about the human-to-human transmission and the extent of the disease, which really was a pandemic earlier than we had thought. And a lot of people have probably seen the reports by Bloomberg that medical researchers estimate that China could have reduced the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases by as much as 95% if officials had implemented containment, isolation, and social distancing 3 weeks earlier than they did, which they could have, but didn't. And even implementing them 1 week earlier than they did would have reduced China's cases by 66% because, they didn't implement until after a lot of people had left Wuhan to go around the country to celebrate Chinese New Year. So we now have demands from nations around the world who have been tragically affected by the pandemic, which has incurred thousands upon thousands of arguably unnecessary deaths to the disease, that the PRC should be accountable for this. So in response to that, last Sunday, the State Council of the People's Republic of China's Information Office issued a white paper entitled "Fighting COVID-19: China in Action," and of course it's full of doubtful statements. But one key message is that the PRC says it will not respond to what it refers to, and I quote, frivolous lawsuits or claims for compensation. So on the one hand, the Chinese regime is concerned about international response and the impact on Chinese campaigns of trying to achieve political influence throughout the world. And on the other hand, they have a domestic worry because Chinese people know that the Chinese Communist Party regime propaganda is consistently unreliable, and therefore there's been a heightened sense of crisis and increasing questioning of how good the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party has been in this matter. So, so the Chinese Communist Party, of course, wants to issue the opposite statement. And I would just say as an aside that when you get white papers issued by the government of the People's Republic of China's State Council, it's typically when they need to issue targeted disinformation. So we've got white papers on the situation in Xinjiang or the situation in Tibet, which at length demonstrate how it is that Tibetans and Uyghurs are only too happy to be subject to authoritarian one-party rule by the Han majority Communist Party, or ones on human rights that identify China as a leader in protecting and promoting human rights. So when you see a white paper on how effective China has been in responding to the COVID-19, one cannot help but have the assumption that there's something there that the Chinese government desperately wants to suppress. Moreover, as we know, the PRC has been able to make strategic use of the coronavirus crisis to further its information narrative in its ongoing global rivalry with the United States. The messaging is that the PRC has been a more responsible and efficacious global ally than the US in sending PPE around the world as a beneficent gesture. And as Michael pointed out, it's led to considerable improvement in the public opinion polling on the PRC versus Germany and France and Italy. In March, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, Zhao Lijian, said this: China's signature strength, efficiency, and speed in this fight has been widely acclaimed. China has set a new standard for the global efforts against the epidemic. China's Communist Party Secretary Xi Jinping is then quoted as reporting to a teleconference of 170,000 communist officials that the recent decline in infections in China, and I quote, once again demonstrated the notable advantages of the leadership of the Communist Party of China and spirit of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Then there's a commentary in the Xinhua News Agency, the New China News Agency, entitled China Acts Responsibly in Global Fight Against Coronavirus, that claims through the epidemic, the international community gets a deeper understanding of China's efforts to safeguard the well-being of mankind. And you see this reported domestically on the Chinese domestic national news, where they haul out all sorts of foreign figures that I've never heard of before to repeat this line that, we appreciate how effectively China has been setting an example for the rest of the world in its superior system that's able to better respond to crises than, chaotic democracy. In contrast, the Chinese Communist Party's English language newspaper, the Global Times, issued a commentary entitled U.S. Political System Stymies Effective Virus Response. Moreover, you're seeing an increase in the sort of Russian style of confusing disinformation. For example, Chinese state media statements to English-speaking audiences via Facebook and Twitter. I say English-speaking audiences because Facebook and Twitter are not accessible inside the People's Republic of China. And on the proliferation, relatively recent proliferation of Chinese ambassadorial Twitter feeds. And they put forward the ludicrous assertion that the novel coronavirus did not originate in a wet market in Wuhan, but was in fact brought to China from the United States. A PRC Foreign Ministry spokesman, Zhao Lijian, wrote on his Twitter feed, which has an astonishing 286,000 followers outside China, that, and I quote, "It might be US Army who brought the epidemic to Wuhan. Be transparent. Make public your data. US owe us an explanation." So he indicated that the source of this information is an article entitled COVID-19, Further Evidence that the Virus Originated in the US. That article was published in Global Research, a publication I'm sure that Marcus must be very familiar with, an online publication of Montreal's Centre for Research on Globalization, a site founded by Mikhail Trosudovsky, a professor emeritus at the University of Ottawa with strong connections to Russian propaganda. So a Canadian connection. And then we see the former ambassador to Canada, Liu Xiaoye, who distinguished himself so greatly by suggesting that Canadians' concern over Michael Kovrig and Michael Favor's arbitrary detention was due to white supremacy in Canada. He's now been promoted to ambassador to France, and he has been falsely claiming that the long-term care facility workers were abandoning French seniors' homes en masse, leaving elderly people to die miserable deaths of starvation in those homes, or the claim that that there are secret U.S. biological laboratories in former Soviet republics that have spread the disease, which is a copy of some Russian propaganda. So, in general, to conclude, we have the idea to create narratives that undermine democracy by suggesting that only China has responded appropriately and effectively to the threat of the novel coronavirus. And these are messages that are well taken up in fragile democracies who wish to strengthen, the authoritarian elements within their political regimes. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Charles. Where would we be without Chinese and Russian benevolence? We'd be really lost in this pandemic without it. So let's move on to a few questions. We've got some moderated questions, and so we're going to take some audience questions. We don't have a heck of a lot of time left. We've got about 25 minutes or so. So I'm going to ask our panelists to answer relatively briefly, if possible. But we've talked a lot about Russia. We've talked a lot about China right now. And I think the first question ought to be, to what degree do you think Russia's and China's interests are aligned with this? I mean, the narratives seem very similar. They seem to be supporting each other. We've heard that fringe Russian platforms, as you've mentioned, Charles, have been promoting conspiracy theories about the origins of COVID-19, which were later, as you mentioned, echoed by Chinese diplomats. Are they working together to advance their shared interests? So let's start with Charles right off the bat, then move on to Suzanne and Michael for this first question.
Yes, I think the short answer is that both Russia and China have a common interest in debasing the value of liberal democracy throughout the world, and so they are able to collaborate to that extent. I don't. I would have to be convinced that there's any formal secret institutions by which the Russians and the Chinese are coordinating, or that there's any notion of an effective alliance between Russia and China. My assessment, and perhaps the other, Michael and Suzanne understand differently, is really there's far too much suspicion of Russia, of the Chinese, and the Chinese of the Russians, and also they see each other as rivals for the same thing, which is to attain, a civilizational and economic dominance. In the case of the Russians, to restore that to an earlier period. In the case of the Chinese, to redress the humiliations of Western imperialism in the 19th century. So I do think that there's a common basis. They both don't like democracy and freedom, but I frankly don't see it as much beyond that.
Thanks, Charles. Suzanne?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, we have said for the last few years that Russia and China are both engaged heavily in influence operations, but they're very different from each other, right? And fundamentally at the bottom, as Charles has said, China has believed that it has a model that it can hold up in comparison to the United States, that it can sell, right? We have a way in which you can maintain order and stability and grow your economy. Right? That's their promise. Putin knows he has no model he can hold up to compete with the idea of liberal democracy. And so his objective has been to pull down the reputation of Western democracy, to say it is no better than the hypocritical and corrupt government in Russia. They're just as hypocritical and corrupt, so don't long for that. And his key audience, of course, is his own population. Second, maybe is the United States. Third, or maybe those are equal, is the audiences around the world where we compete for influence. What's changed, I think, just in the last year or so, maybe particularly in the last few weeks, is the degree to which China is adopting Russia's playbook in information operations. And I think part of that is because China realizes both it is on the defensive with respect to whether it was truthful and timely with respect to the coronavirus, but I think more fundamentally even is the threat to its economy. So a key part of what it has been able to sell, as I said, is look, we've got great economic growth, and I think they know they're in for a big hit. So is everyone else, but I think it has thrown it off its game a bit, and so it's now reaching to try to level the playing field, pull the West down a little bit more, because it knows it's going to be down also. So I think we're seeing that coincidence of interest. We began to see it in the justice system, for example, with Huawei, the arrest of the Huawei official in Canada, where China began to really directly accuse the justice system of being a pawn of the politicians. That, again, is a key narrative Russia has pushed.
Right, absolutely. Michael, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, I certainly agree that Russia and China are aligned on pushing this kind of anti-Western sentiment and conspiracy, and positioning themselves as the bulwarks of civilization, and authoritarian models get the job done better than democracies. But it's interesting. Just this morning, I was reading an interview with Steve Bannon in the Asia Times, which was all about his extreme hawkishness toward Beijing. And I mean, I read Bannon, even though he's out of government now, because he does have the ear of the president, meaning the president of the United States. And he's basically advocated and said that this election, meaning the US presidential election coming up in 5 months, is going to largely revolve around the insidiousness of China on the global stage. So expect Donald Trump to say this is the Wuhan virus. Expect him to try and link Joe Biden, his rival, to Chinese commercial and investment enterprise, all that kind of thing, which rather puts Russia in a pretty good position, right? Because on the one hand, Moscow and Beijing are aligned in the broad strokes. On the other hand, you'll not hear an ill word about Vladimir Putin coming from the US president, right? So it kind of indemnifies Russia for the blame of being this purveyor of conspiracy theories and all kinds of craziness, and puts the real onus on China, not only as a portal of disinformation and propaganda, but as the incubator, possibly in a kind of military industrial sense, of this global pandemic. Just a final point. I mean, look, the Russians are really past masters, as I said earlier, at studying the various pathologies within democratic societies. And if you look at the Mueller report, if you look at some of the reporting that came out at the height of the Russian interference campaign, with the possible exception of the conspiracy theory that Seth Rich, the Democratic National Committee employee, was the real source of WikiLeaks' stolen correspondence from the DNC and the Podesta trove, which, according to Yahoo, was planted by the SVR, like a concocted active measure. With the exception of that, everything else, whether it's Hillary Clinton in indulging in some satanic repast, the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, all the rest of it came from the precincts of the alt-right, from crazy Reddit subthreads on the internet. Now, that's not to say these places haven't been infiltrated by Russian actors, but really these are American pathologies, and the Kremlin simply acts as an amplifier. It creates a platform for people who otherwise wouldn't have it in this country. And they're doing the same thing with coronavirus. I mean, I mentioned the Bill Gates idiocy. The two biggest purveyors of that allegation that Bill Gates is responsible are Roger Stone, a convicted felon who, yes, has his own ties and communication with Russian intelligence, as we know, and Laura Ingraham, who's a presenter on Fox News. So the Russians don't really have to do much work to kind of pull the wool over our eyes, because we're pulling it over our own eyes.
Right. So they're injecting these narratives into our debate, into our media.
Yeah.
And we're doing most of the damage ourselves. But so I think the next question is, how do we fight back against this? I mean, foreign regimes, especially these malign foreign regimes, are responsible often for introducing these narratives and for amplifying them. So on a recent call that was hosted by the Canadian government, an official said that it's important that we do not point the finger at or identify any foreign governments when it comes to disinformation and influence operations. And meanwhile, we have the European Commission, who said yesterday that if we have evidence of disinformation, that we should not shy away from naming and shaming. So while Canada is seeking to work with all sorts of international partners and such to address foreign disinformation at the moment, the EU approach seems to conflict with Canada's specifically. So my question is it important for us to call out malign foreign actors and expose disinformation and influence campaigns? And do we risk anything by not calling it out? So I'll ask Suzanne, and then we'll go to Michael, and then Charles.
Yeah, Marcus, thank you. I think it's critically important that we educate the public about what's going on and that we be as specific as we can be. This is, again, there are lots of discussion about what the platforms can do in terms of fact checking and labeling and all of those things I think are really good and important, teaching media literacy, et cetera. But at the end of the day, we've got to build public resilience against the pernicious messaging. And part of that is helping the public understand what that messaging is, where it's coming from, and why, right? So that when they hear it, an alarm bell goes off and a warning flag. I think it's critically important to name it, and that's why I put out the report that we put out called Beyond the Ballot about what was happening with the justice system, which I don't think anyone's paying any attention to.
No, definitely ensuring that there's sufficient media literacy and digital sort of news literacy. That's really important to building resilience within our societies. Michael, your thoughts
on how to combat disinformation?
Yeah.
I mean, gosh, you mentioned the report I did with Peter in 2014, where things seemed a lot simpler because it was mostly focused on Ukraine and just sort of swatting away the various falsehoods that were being disseminated about that war. Now this is not only spread to what Russia is doing with respect to American domestic politics. I mean, you mentioned the Black Lives Matter. Check out RT or Sputnik and the stuff that they're saying about. I mean, they're actually siding with American law enforcement more often than not, saying that cops should be cracking more skulls. And as you pointed out, that this whole thing is a conspiracy, sown by Soros and Gates and so on. But look, I mean, as I said earlier, and this is sort of, I guess, the disillusionment or demoralization I experience on a day-to-day basis about my own society and country. These things would not work if people were just a little bit smarter and a little bit more media savvy and literate. And, yes, technology has a role to play. I mean, you've seen the debate about fact-checking the president's tweets. Well, if they're fact-checking the president's tweets, but allowing Holocaust deniers and people who spread all kinds of other malicious and in some cases lethal falsehoods and conspiracy theories, where does that leave us? And I don't have all the answers myself. All I can say is, the one rule of thumb, as far as I can tell, is, if you really want to defeat active measures, don't be a dupe. Don't be a witting or unwitting accomplice to them. And learn who the sources are and learn to, we need to restore some faith and trust and credibility in American media institutions. And God knows, look, I've worked for several of them. Everybody makes mistakes, everybody screws up, and everybody does push a kind of narrative which could at any moment combust. But, you know, if you're comparing, say, the BBC with RT or the New York Times with, I don't know, I mean, some Chinese or Iranian newspaper, you've really lost the plot, right? So it's about kind of bringing us back down to earth. And also, finally, look, elections matter here, because unfortunately, in the United States, there is a kind of top-down phenomenon. Yes, we have grassroots, we have a civil society, but the occupant of the White House sort of sets the national agenda, if only because we're reacting to everything that he or she might say or do policy-wise. So the next election, I think, is going to be crucial, not in terms of curing us of this kind of pathological penchant for conspiracy theories and BS, but at least kind of resetting the tone. And broadcasting to the world that, okay, a liberal democracy in the United States may be on the ropes, but it's not quite dead yet.
Right. So it really does come down to us as individuals to consume media in a smarter way, to check the sources and to check the claims that are being made there, and not just to accept everything blindly.
Right.
Now, before I go to Charles, there's a question from MP Bob Zimmer that came in, more of a comment, because this is exactly what we're talking about. Bob Zimmer says, as former chair of our Access to Info, Privacy and Ethics, and co-chair of the International Grant Committee on I think media, and he's a conservative, he's listening closely. The panel has enlightened us on the problem of disinformation and its weaponization. His committee made several recommendations to government. Unfortunately, not many were implemented. And he asks, what do you propose we do about it, especially to prevent its impacts on democracy? And that's exactly what we're talking about right now. And Charles is going to have a chance to answer Bob's question right now.
Well, I am very concerned about this, and certainly I think that the putting pressure on Twitter and Facebook to do more fact checking and to give people a notion that information is inaccurate is a good idea. The thing is that, you know, the false allegations are so much more interesting often than the truth. You know, there was an utterly false allegation a few months ago that spread through the internet that our prime minister had been fired from his high school teaching job because of sexual impropriety with teenage girls. Well, this is completely untrue. There's no basis for it whatsoever, but it had a sort of presence, and the taint of a false allegation is never fully erased. And so from that point of view, you know, I think that we meet a lot of challenge with this. I think we have to identify, in terms of the political false allegations, where they're coming from and apply censorious measures against them. And of course, as Marcus has been a major champion for, you know, use of Magnitsky lists to name and shame people who are complicit in this sort of dishonorable, shameful behavior might be one method of addressing it. But I think that there's going to be more and more of this. And as mainstream media becomes less and less economically viable, we're going to see less and less ability to ensure that the information that we're consuming is in fact factually based on accurate data, and not based on politically motivated desires to shape a discourse in a way which goes against the truth. So I am really very worried about this, and I don't see any easy solution.
Well, just going to your point about the disinformation about Prime Minister Trudeau, there's a Twitter account named Press Corps, which has several thousand followers. Just a few weeks ago, they were promoting a story that every time the Prime Minister comes out, they'd take screenshots and try to convince their viewers or their followers that he was actually wearing an ankle bracelet, that he was actually under arrest. And if you go on, I mean, the stories are completely outrageous, but they're still getting tweeted by hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. Now, just looking at the time, I think we have time for maybe two more questions. This one comes from Akash Maharaj, who is with the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption. Now, Akash asks, My experience is that authoritarian states often receive a receptive hearing for their propaganda because they approach smaller and poorer nations while bearing desperately needed help with those nations' humanitarian infrastructure needs, even though that help tends to come with very costly strings. Can democratic states like Canada narrow the field for international disinformation by offering poorer nations alternative streams for the practical help they need? And let's start with Charles and go to Michael and then Suzanne on this one.
Well, I mean, I think, a major difference in terms of engaging on disinformation between Russia and China is that China has so much more money that they're prepared to put into initiatives like the Belt and Road Infrastructure Project, which tends to feed corruption and debt in other countries. So, the things that go along with that, the digital Silk Road, which is designed to install telecommunication systems, but also provides authoritarian governments with systematic technological means to do censorship and to spy on citizens, goes along with that. So I do think that fragile democracies are much more amenable to the Chinese information spin, and in fact, a lot of the media in those countries are prepared to accept stories, that are given to them by Chinese media at a very reasonable price. For example, in many third world countries, they're able to get the Chinese English language propaganda on their cable systems at a very reasonable cost, which makes it much more economically feasible for them to broadcast Chinese propaganda than, say, the BBC or CNN, for which their cable networks would have to pay a lot more. So, I think that the point is very well taken, that there is an issue here that poorer and weaker democracies are more susceptible to Chinese blandishments.
Great. Thanks, Charles.
Well, I was listening to a conversation earlier this week between John Cipher and Don Jensen about exactly this. And John Cipher was the head of Russia House at Langley for several years, and he mentioned the interesting case of Zimbabwe, where at one point the president of Zimbabwe got up and gave this public speech announcing that I think it was his son, or maybe it was his son-in-law, had contracted the AIDS virus. And this was sort of going to be a national moment of the kind of cataclysmic moment for the country, which had been already racked by a previous contagion. And then he followed it up by saying, well, as we all know, AIDS was created by the United States and the US military, the CIA or whatever, which goes back to one of the most successful Soviet active measures in history, which was Operation Infection, right? The dissemination of this lie that the United States created AIDS as a biological weapon. As against that, however, you have things like PEPFAR, which was the Bush administration's policy of essentially helping to contain AIDS throughout Africa, probably the most successful foreign policy that administration had undertaken, which sort of counterintuitively, perhaps for the rest of the world, made George W. Bush quite popular on the continent of Africa. So yeah, there is absolutely a place for the West to put its money where its mouth is, if you like, and sort of help struggling countries, whether they're democratic or transitioning to democratic, contain things like public health crises and the rest of it. And look, I mean, part of the problem is, as I mentioned earlier, in Italy, old men putting up videos on social media, tearing down their own flag or the EU flag and putting up the Russian one. That's not a Russian conspiracy. That's just a genuine sentiment, because they believe, hey, where was our own government? Where was our own, where was Brussels to bail us out of this crisis? And why are the Russian, biological and chemical defense police coming in to do what our own government should have done? So, a part of this is getting your own house in order and providing the kind of largesse that is necessary. I mean, I hate the cliche hearts and minds, but there's unfortunately no better term for it, right? So yeah, this is the role that liberal democracy still has to play in the developing world. And it's a role arguably that it's abandoned in recent years.
So clearly we should be doing more. Suzanne, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll pick up where Michael left off, which is sadly, we've seen a decline in foreign aid and support for foreign aid. And I would be nice to think that as individuals, particularly on the right, turn up the volume on anti-China, rhetoric and emphasis, if that could be combined with a recognition that we need to compete with them. One of the areas we need to compete with them is this foreign aid. It'd be ironic, but welcome if those who have always over the years failed to support foreign aid finally saw a connection here and how essential it is to our national security.
Perfect. Thanks, Suzanne. Now, again, looking at the time, I think we need to start wrapping up, and maybe we can get some concluding remarks from all of our panelists based on some of all of what we talked about, and the fact that looking forward as to what China and Russia might be doing as far as disinformation and influence campaigns are concerned. We've seen, of course, China using the pandemic as a cover for its crackdown in Hong Kong over the past few weeks. We have a looming U.S. presidential election in November. And coming up now on July 1st, we have Vladimir Putin seeking the ratification of his proposal to remain Russia's president until 2036, making him essentially president for life. What should we expect to see with regards to information warfare and influence campaigns over the next 12 to 24 months? And maybe we can start with Suzanne, go to Michael, and finish up with Charles.
Yeah, so my biggest worry, as I indicated earlier, is the confluence of all of these things coming together around our elections. So here's how my worry about how this plays out. We have COVID, which has been increasingly politicized, and that is exacerbated by some of these disinformation efforts that we've talked about. I've talked about the disinformation undermining the public's trust and confidence in the courts, and belief that the judges and courts are just political, right? Our politicians who wear robes. We have election officials trying to make decisions about how to go forward with elections in a time of COVID. And we see those decisions, which will all be emotionally charged because COVID is both politically, and election decisions are by their nature viewed as political and partisan. Those are being challenged in the courts. And with each decision, the losers of those decisions accuse the court and the judge of being political, of being partisan, of favoring their partisan, overlords, if you will. Now, fast forward to November, and we have a close election, and we have questions raised about the legitimacy of the election, fueled by disinformation about the system being rigged, perhaps by fake claims of having gotten into and changed votes, etc. It goes to the courts, which we normally rely upon to resolve the issue, to allow the peaceful transition of power, except now there's a significant segment of the population that is perhaps unwilling to accept the decision of the courts. So I really do worry about the potential impact on the peaceful transition of power.
That is a terrifying scenario, Suzanne. Michael?
Well, look, I think, as I say, technology or publicly traded corporations that have created these social media behemoths, and it probably got a little too big for their britches, have a moral responsibility, not just to their own society, but to the world at large, to try and do as much as they can to push back against. There's a difference between a falsehood or what we would call misinformation and disinformation. So things that can be traced to foreign governments, things that can be traced to intelligence or influence operations that are known to be complete falsehoods don't really belong in the agora, in our public discourse. Or if they do, they belong there as kind of case studies or anatomies of how to gaslight and manipulate people using lies. I think another important thing, which fortunately I'm seeing some movement on, is foreign agent registration in the United States. I mean, don't forget, a lot of the people doing the disseminating of these lies are American citizens, and they have collected money from foreign governments, be it Turkey, Russia, China, or whatever, without disclosing that they have a vested interest in pushing this agenda. So I think solidifying FARA registration, just to show Americans that the fellow Americans who are talking to you are not necessarily doing so in good faith, is another kind of sort of benchmark we can reach for. And then, I mean, I might as well flag the latest report that I did with Casey Michel and the Free Russia Foundation, which is preventing foreign industrialists and foreign billionaires, particularly oligarchs from not only Russia, but the former Soviet Union, from waging frivolous libel complaints against American and Western reporters who are doing what is in the public interest, which is to say scrutinizing how these guys made their money, what they've been doing with their money, and to what extent they've been instrumentalized by their government as kind of plenipotentiaries to push an agenda in the American or the European democratic system. Eliminating that constraint from a free press is crucial, because as a reporter, I can tell you, doing investigations against deep-pocketed and influential, figures, particularly foreigners, it doesn't even cross the threshold of being edited and legally vetted, because a lot of institutions simply don't want to be bothered with dealing with the legal headaches that derive therefrom. So just a few modest suggestions for how to improve the situation.
Well, certainly a foreign agents registry is something that we're debating here in Canada. And do you think it's something that's worked? Is it something that Canada should consider adopting, Michael?
Well, I mean, put it this way: people forget in the controversy of Michael Flynn's conviction, sentencing, and now motion to dismiss by the Bar Justice Department, that he was also found guilty of having been on Turkey's payroll without disclosing it. So failure to register when you are in fact a foreign agent taking money from a foreign government is a criminal offense in the United States. And if it gets to that level, then sure. I mean, people can be prosecuted for simply not doing what is they're legally duty bound to do. So I see no reason why Canada couldn't adopt that. I don't know if, I'm not familiar with Canadian law, but another measure that we have here is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which says that any American citizen or American company, forget about taking bribes or doing shady financial deals on their own soil. When they go abroad, they can't do that either, because they can be prosecuted here. I would recommend every liberal democracy have some similar form legislation to that, just to stamp out corruption.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Charles, your thoughts?
Well, I think that, certainly I think that China's geostrategic rise is the challenge of our age. And I agree with what Suzanne is saying, which is that the Chinese economy is in a tricky situation, and the leadership of China domestically is more and more fragile as a result. Not to speak of, in China, domestic discontent with what happened with the coronavirus, combined with the possibility of increasing foreign demands for accountability and an independent investigation of what happened. And, we know that when Australia suggested such a thing, China came out very strong, saying that they would, stop Australian wine and meat from entering the Chinese market, or the students and tourists would be reduced. And in fact, they did engage in some measures against barley to punish Australia. So these are very strong responses. And I would expect commensurately that we would see a lot more disinformation, more stuff going out on social media, more attempts to suppress alternative discourse in Chinese language media in Canada and other media. And as Michael says, probably more use of lawfare, which, as some of you may know, I'm subject to a lawsuit relating to an article that I wrote called The Murky World of Chinese Influence. We might see a lot more of that to disincentive alternative discourses. But I think essentially when the Chinese government feels challenged, that they seek to defer the attention of people by inflaming nationalism. And so increasing hostility by the Chinese regime towards the US and the West actually plays well domestically in terms of responding to the Chinese Communist Party's main imperative, which is how do we ensure that our power is sustained. So we could see a lot more disinformation, a lot more alternative discourse, a lot more threat to Taiwan, and more assertiveness in the South China Sea, and in co-opting fragile democracies to become more aligned with China's global purposes. So I'm not too optimistic about how things are going to pan out in the next year. I think that we're in for a very challenging period, and one that the Western democracies should try and align themselves together to come up with a common response to try and protect the international rules-based order against a resentful and angry China.
Well, thank you for that. Clearly, there are massive challenges ahead, and this disinformation and influence operations really does seem to be the real challenge of our time. Once again, I'd like to thank our guests, Suzanne Spalding, Michael Weiss, and Charles Burton, and all of you for joining us for this Macdonald-Laurier webinar on disinformation in the COVID era and beyond. Hopefully, we can continue this discussion down the road. Thanks again for joining us. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.